Hello, in today's video I want to answer the question, was there a way for Hitler to win World War II? And I would argue that in the long run there was no way for him to truly win World War II, but there was a way for him to win the war in the short run. And when I say in the short run, I'm talking about Hitler occupying the Soviet Union, or at least significant parts of the Soviet Union for the, let's say, next 20 to 30 years. And okay, so here we can see the anti-fascist coalition, green, versus the fascist coalition on the world stage. And it is obvious that the fascists were greatly outnumbered, and they had to face just economic giants of the United States and the Soviet Union combined against their war machine, which is why I think that there is only one realistic scenario in which the Germans could win World War II. And I'm not even talking about Hitler developing nuclear weapons, because I think that ultimately even that wouldn't have helped him, because it takes a long time to develop a nuclear weapon. And even if Nazis were able to, for example, destroy Moscow in 1945 or 44, the Soviets could still win on the battlefield. Not to mention that the Americans were also already nearing German borders at the time. So the only realistic scenario in which Hitler could win, at least for a while, and I'll explain why I think for a while is the best case scenario for Hitler, is the scenario in which the Japanese empire attacks the Soviet Union instead of the Americans. And here we can see the Japanese empire defeating the Russian empire in the war of 1905. And after that war, Russian military generally had a very bad reputation in the world, and the Japanese saw them as weak. But then something unexpected happened. The Battle of Nomonhan, the battle in the Far East that happened between the Soviets and the Japanese. And young Zhukov wins this battle. The Japanese troops suffer a catastrophic defeat, and because of that one battle, many historians argue the Japanese became convinced that the Soviets still preserved their ancient masculine virtues that make them strong, and they still, or I should say, they began to respect the Soviet military again. And in the mind of the Japanese ultra-militaristic and aggressive generals, the Americans were becoming a weak nation, because they were liberal and because they were more peaceful than the Soviet Union. And peacefulness and liberalism make men weak, according to the Japanese military. So they had ideological reasons to believe that the Americans would be an easier target than the Soviets. But other than that, they had some very practical and economic reasons for attacking the United States. So after the fall of France, the Japanese occupy French colonies, and that makes them dangerously close to the Philippines. And Roosevelt really doesn't appreciate the Japanese occupation of Indochina, which is why he decides to do something, one might say, radical. He seizes the Japanese assets in the United States, and the proud Japanese people at the time see it as an insult that can only be washed with blood of the Americans in this case. And they're also expecting the Americans to declare war on them in the near future, which is why they now, after their assets were frozen, they began to expect the Americans to attack them in the near future, which is why they decide to strike first and destroy their navy. and the sleeping giant of the United States is awakened after Pearl Harbor, and that definitely made the war much shorter and perhaps even changed the outcome of the entire war. But okay, let us now imagine for a moment a scenario in which instead of Zhukov, Stalin sent somebody completely inefficient. And let's imagine that the Soviets lost the Battle of Nomonhan, and let's also imagine that Roosevelt, for whatever reason, decided not to freeze the Japanese assets in the United States. Now, these two things would have to be different in order for the Japanese not to attack the United States. But also, what is not often mentioned is that the Japanese and the Americans were engaged in an economic battle for dominance over the Pacific for the most of the first half of the 20th century. So that was an additional reason, just pure economic imperialism on both sides, actually. But in this scenario, the Japanese attacked the Soviets, and here is the line that was proposed by the German military, demarcation between this hypothetical Japanese and German spheres of influence in the world. And had the Japanese attacked the Soviet Union, I could see something like that happen. If they attacked with their full military might unexpectedly, if the Russians were unable to respond in a good way, if they just kept losing the battles like they were losing in 1941 against the Germans, if the Japanese, one could say, got lucky and had equally competent generals like the Germans, I could see something like this happening. And okay, but let me explain now why I still think that in 20 to 40 years this new German empire still would have collapsed and lost the war. So ultimately I think that the United States and Germany would still at one point have to go to war with each other, although now it would be much harder for the United States to win because Germany would control more territory and more population they could recruit to their military, and they would have more oil, more food, more steel, more aluminium and other valuable assets. But still, I don't think that Germany could have, even this enlarged Germany could have won against the military might of the United States in the long run, because let us not forget that even in this scenario United States would have developed nukes, and there are some additional reasons for why I think that Germany would have to go to war with the United States. First of all, Hitler on multiple occasions said he wanted to wipe out all the American Jews. He saw America as a nation controlled by the Jewish media. He also just despised liberalism, and I don't think he would let such a huge country and such an economic giant to exist and show to the world that liberalism leads to prosperity, or at least that it can lead to prosperity. And the third and probably the most important reason is that Hitler was crazy enough and to actually to want to dominate the entire world. And not to mention that there was already a submarine war happening between the United States and Germany, and submarine wars can very easily lead to real wars, or at least to full-scale wars. And in a scenario in which the United States decides to go to war with Germany, I'm convinced that they would have to use nuclear weapons in order to win. And there is also one additional reason for why I think that Hitler would eventually go to war with the United States. So After the quick fall of France, Hitler became convinced in this myth of German invincibility, in this myth that Germany will always win because the Germans are just superior. But the France fell quickly, not because Germans are superior, but because Manstein attacked through the Ardennes, and the French simply didn't expect this brilliant military maneuver to occur, because at the times many thought that you actually can't pass with tanks through the Ardennes, but it turns out you can. It was a risky tactic, but it worked. And let us now imagine that after the quick fall of France, there is a quick fall of the Soviet Union, and Hitler's crazy beliefs would have been reinforced, and he would believe even more in German absolute invincibility. And in this scenario, I find it hard for Hitler to resist attacking the United States. After all, Hitler wasn't a person that was inclined to forgive, and the Americans already gave a lot of their money and resources to both the British Empire and to the Soviets. And Hitler, as I already said, was all about vengeance, and he wasn't a forgetful person or a merciful person. Let's put it that way. So in this scenario, I believe the Americans would have to use nuclear weapons, and they would destroy the biggest cities in this new German empire, and perhaps they would even manage to kill Hitler by surprise. Let's say that in this scenario Hitler even isn't aware of Americans having nuclear weapons, and one day Berlin is just annihilated and Hitler dies. I could very easily imagine a scenario like that, and that would have crippled the German war machine and create chaos for a while, but it still would be very difficult for the Americans to win this war. And here's what I think would have happened with Europe. Here you can see Europe after the, or I should say during World War I. Russia is reduced to warlords, to the, as they're called in the literature, White Army anti-communist warlords waging war on the Soviets. And something similar would have happened this time, but instead of Russian warlords, we would have German generals becoming warlords and having their own states that are, and these states would be fighting against the Soviet insurgency in the east. And I'm sure that many strong communist guerrilla movements would emerge, like they did in China and in Yugoslavia. This time they would be aided by the British and by the Americans. And there is also one important factor that would, I believe, lead to the doom of fascism, even in this horrible scenario in which the fascists won. And that is the fact that I think that in the long run, a war between the Japanese and between Hitler was inevitable. Hitler even said so himself. He used to say to his generals to have, to his officers generally, to have as much children as they can, because the war with the Japanese is inevitable. And since both countries were extremely aggressive and militaristic and racist, I'm convinced that they would sooner or later go to war with each other for world domination. Not to mention that Japanese generals were inclined often to just attack out of pride, and they probably wouldn't be too happy with Germany being the most dominant country in the world. They would probably want to have that title for Japan, and that's why I think that war between these two militaristic societies was inevitable. And in this horrible scenario, the world is now fighting a war a four-way war between the communist insurgency, Germany, Japan, and the free world of the United States. And so in the scenario in which Hitler wins Second World War, we wouldn't get a 1,000-year Reich as he hoped. We would get something like an African dictatorship after you kill the dictator. Just warlords slaughtering each other for territory and resources until finally they are conquered by the United States, or until the communist insurgency creates its own states. But again, this is just a most plausible scenario according to me, and if you have other ideas about what would have happened in such a scenario, please tell me in the comment section.